Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So today we're going to talk about liberalism, torture, and the ticking time bomb by David Luban. And this article was written in '05 in the wake of the September 11, 2001 terror attacks. And for those of you too young to recall this, there was a lively debate in the United States at the time about the merits of torture, right? And as Luban points out, liberal societies, and by liberal we don't mean the what we typically think of the conservative liberal divide in the United States right now, um, but by liberal he just means the 19th century conception of liberalism in which states respect human rights. They value limited government, that is to say governments that don't practice paternalistic laws. We'll talk about paternalistic laws next week when we start talking about drugs. And governments that don't practice torture. Well, again, in light of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, there was this lively debate in the United States about the merits of torture or not, right? And then it was revealed that in 2003 at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, American agents, CIA, and military had in fact tortured people and raped and in some instances tortured people to death, right? But it's often argued by folks like Alan Dershowitz, who was one of President Trump's impeachment lawyers in his first impeachment, that if there were a ticking time bomb planted somewhere in downtown Manhattan, right, we would be justified, completely justified in torturing that person. Well, that's to assume a lot. But before we get to that, really quickly, um, uh, the editor of your textbook, Stuart Rachels, or excuse me, James Rachels, right? He wants to talk about some very important points about torture that Luban didn't even mention in his article, right? So, number one, if you torture the enemy will be more likely to torture you, right? At that point, it's just the gloves are off scenario. Two, the enemy will be less likely to surrender if they fear being tortured, and so your your difficulties on the battlefield will be compounded. Three, the enemy may cite your harsh tactics in recruiting volunteers. Four, in a military occupation, torturing the enemy will turn the local population against you, thus resulting in more enemies and fewer informants. Five, a country that violates human rights will find other countries less cooperative, both economically and militarily. Six, a country that breaks international law cannot rightly object when other countries do the same. And regarding points 5 and 6, you need look no further than Russia, right? Right now, Russia is an international pariah. And why? It's because Vladimir Putin's government tries routinely, summarily executes dissidents and journalists who criticize Putin, and just recently tried to poison a dissident with a nerve agent, right? In this day and age, we don't generally, we being the international community, we don't like to interact with people who practice summary executions and torture. And again, you need another example of that. Look at all the controversy surrounding Crown Prince uh, uh, um, Salman in Saudi Arabia after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. He's an international pariah now. Point seven. Someone being severely interrogated will answer a question regardless of whether he knows the answer. He might make a guess, he might say what he thinks the interrogator wants to hear, or he might have been trained to tell a particular lie. In short, the point of number seven is that torture is not a reliable means of gaining information. But even if, as we'll see, even if it was, it still wouldn't be justified. 8. A country that tortures will find it difficult to prosecute terrorists for crimes because the defendants can always say that the evidence was obtained illegally through torture. It's not going to stand up in an international court. 9. To obtain useful information, bribes often work better than torture, but once you start torturing, it's hard to develop a cooperative relationship with the enemy. As a matter of fact, regarding point 9 that Rachel's made, um, during World War II, that's precisely what the American government did with Nazi SS prisoners. They would take them to Leavenworth Prison in Kansas, and after that, they would dress them up, clean them up, dress them up, take them to Kansas City, and buy them steak dinners, wine and dine them, and then the Nazis would start telling everything they knew. There are far more effective means of getting information than torturing people. So Luban, for his part, uh, he lists 5 aims of torture. Right? What are the 5 aims of torture? All right. Well, number 1, there is torture for the purpose of terrorizing people into submission. That's what dictators do. That's what Putin's doing. That's what um, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia was doing. Right? Second, until the last 2 centuries, torture was used as a form of criminal punishment. 3, um, torture used as a means to extract confessions from criminal suspects. And fourth, right? Um, let me see where to find the fourth one here. Uh, oh, yes, punishment and extracting confessions. And he notes that none of those 4 are now acceptable to the international community, right? And just states in general, right? States still do this, but they do their best to cover it up. They don't want the public to know because the public doesn't have any appetite for this anymore, right? Generally speaking. So what about 5? Well, this is what he being Luban calls the only acceptable rationale for torture that's left, right? And that torture is a technique of intelligence gathering from captives who will not talk, right? And that brings us to the point about the ticking time bomb scenario, right? So again, we talked about the scenario. There's a time bomb planted somewhere in downtown New York City, Midtown Manhattan, and it's going to go off. And we found someone who we think knows something about it, so we're going to torture him. As Luban points out, first off, this scenario is ludicrously implausible, right? It just almost never happens that way, right? So here on page 220, he asks, right? We're going to raise some realistic hypotheticals into questions they raise. The authorities know there may be a bomb plot in the offing, and they have captured a man who may know something about it, but he may not. Do you torture him for how much? Right? Severely? For weeks? For months? The chances are considerable that you're torturing a man with nothing to tell you. If he doesn't talk, does that mean it's time to stop, or is it time to ramp up the level of torture? How likely does it have to be that he knows something important? 55%? 37%? Will 1 out of 100 suffice to land him on the waterboard? 2, do you really want to make the torture decision by running the numbers? A 1% chance of saving 1,000 lives yields 10 statistical lives. Does that mean you can torture up to 9 people on a 1% chance of finding critical information? 3, the authorities think that 1 out of a group of 50 captives in Guantanamo Bay might know where Osama bin Laden was hiding, but they do not know which captive knows this information. Do you torture them all? That is, do you torture 49 captives with nothing to tell you on the uncertain chance of capturing bin Laden? 4, for that matter, would capturing Osama bin Laden demonstrably save a single human life? Or does it not matter whether torture is intended to save human lives from a specific threat as long as it furthers some goal in the war on terror? So, really quick, let's talk about this because as we know, Osama bin Laden was in fact captured, right? Was it due to torture? No, as a matter of fact, it was due to bribery. They being the CIA, bribed his doctor to give him up. 5, indeed, if you're willing to torture 49 innocent people to get information from the one who has it, why stop there? Why not torture their loved ones? Why not torture innocent women and children who are related to the terrorists, right? So, here's the take-home point, gang, about torture in general, right? And Luban really sums it up nicely here. My conclusion is very simple. Abu Ghraib is the fully predictable image of what a torture culture looks like. Abu Ghraib was not, as the media portrayed it, right, as the Bush administration portrayed it in 05, the result of a few bad apples. Rather, it's the apple tree, right? And you cannot reasonably expect that interrogators in a torture culture will be the fastidious and well-meaning torturers that the liberal ideology fantasizes. And ultimately, right, that brings us to our take-home point. We don't want to be the kind of people that torture or encourage torture, because there is no imaginary safety, right? There is no safety there. There's no point at which the torture will stop and say, okay, that's enough. Rather, once you start torturing, you're off and running, right? And That's precisely what we've seen. It never stops with just a little torture. It's always it becomes exponential, right? Torture, rape, and it degrades the moral personalities, the moral character of the people who inflict it, and that's why it needs to be so vigorously resisted.